New Hampshire, home to such a myriad of interesting things like trees, leaves, water, and rocks.
But how does such a small state connect to the worldwide conflicts occurring throughout the 20th century? Specifically, how did New Hampshire influence the development of the Asian continent at the beginning of the 20th century? Well, the short answer might be through the Treaty of Portsmouth, but there's far more to the story than that.
I don't know, where to begin.
First, it's important to acknowledge how both Russia and Japan came into their own. To do so, one must go back over 150 years to the other side of the globe. For the Russian Empire, the Crimean War was a turning point. This war, fought between the aforementioned Russian Empire and Britain, France, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire, is notable both for its use of industrial technology, namely railways and telegraphs, and what it meant for Russia. They lost, exposing the flaws in having such a large country, which, while partially industrialized, was still incredibly rural and under the system of serfdom. Seeing this, some reforms were made, including an increased push for industrialization and expansion into Asia.
On the Japanese side, a similar transformation occurred, though on a much grander scale. Up until the mid-1800s, Japan was almost completely cut off from the rest of the world, with few exceptions. However, this would soon change. To see how, it's important to discuss China.
The First Opium War was waged in 1839 up until 1842 between Britain and the Qing dynasty. China lost. As a result, they were forced to grant trade concessions to Britain as they opened more ports to trade. Because of this, the treaties made in the wake of the war and the Second Opium War were known as unequal treaties, as they almost entirely favored the victors. This behavior would serve as the basis for Americans in Japan. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry rolled up to Japan with warships. Tokyo, then Edo, is located next to the ocean, meaning that these posed a direct threat to the safety of Japan. This gunboat diplomacy of Commodore Perry marks the most identifiable change in Japan's foreign relations. Much like Britain and other Western empires had done with China earlier in the First Opium War, America forced Japan to open up the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate. Later treaties increased the number of ports opened and the number of Western countries who now could trade with Japan. This incursion led to the idea of Japan's unequal treaties, where Japan was subordinate to the Western powers who forced their hand into granting trade concessions.
It would be misleading to call Commodore Perry's threats against Japan the only reason for change, as the First Opium War showed them how the Westerners would come for their trade. However, it kickstarted their industrialization. Japan suffered economically from the treaties, and thus the urge to westernize and modernize the country took hold. The already weakened Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown, and in 1868 the Meiji Restoration began.
A number of changes came over Japan. The opening of the country allowed for greater spread of knowledge, and while Japan initially suffered, they quickly capitalized. In the span of a few decades, the country created a stronger economy, increased military, and the idea of becoming equal to Westerners spread. The term Fukoku Kyohei, or rich nation, strong military, is representative of the general mindset in Japan. However, some also sought to distance themselves from the West, wanting to be equal, not subordinate. In any case, Japan became industrialized, and with it, increased their power. And what else could be done with power but expansion?
This came to a head in the First Sino-Japanese War, which was mainly fought over Korea. Just like the rest of the Asian countries previously discussed, Korea was subject to foreign influence too. This war was mainly caused by... never mind.
In short, Japan maneuvered themselves into a position where they could send troops into Korea, which was being encroached upon by a number of countries, and fought China. Now, a small, definitely weak country like Japan couldn't possibly defeat a relatively established country like China, could it? Japan's victory is where Russia re-enters the story. Their construction of railways now stretched across the country, coming dangerously close to areas that Japan wanted to influence. Furthermore, they were a part of the Triple Intervention, a collection of three countries, Russia, Germany, and France, who intervened to prevent Japan from seizing the Liaodong Peninsula. Russia took it for itself, building railways on it and establishing Port Arthur.
Japan did not take to this development kindly. Liaodong, part of Manchuria, was important to Japan's wishes to expand upon their influence in Korea.
Eventually, Japan began war again, except this time against Russia. Prior to this war, they created an alliance with Britain, ensuring that if another country stepped in, Britain would support Japan as well. However, this was unnecessary, as Japan's attacks upon Port Arthur, which occurred before a declaration of war even found its way to Moscow, commenced a fairly successful campaign against the Russians. They even destroyed much of the Russian fleet in early 1905. Yet even with this success, the cost of the war became clear to both sides. Even though Japan may have been winning by conventional metrics, the cost of the war was unsustainable, so both countries tried to find peace. And where else would these negotiations take place?
But here, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. In an attempt to bring about an end to the war, Japan reached out to Theodore Roosevelt to find a place for negotiations.
The meeting would take place at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where Japan and Russia came to sign a treaty to finally end the war. The treaty, like all good compromises, left nobody satisfied, except maybe Teddy, who made out with the Nobel Peace Prize without ever having to attend the conference himself. Japan got the lower half of the island, and Russia's lease on South Manchuria, including the railways, while Russia didn't have to give up an indemnity. A win for them, I guess.
Thankfully, both sides took it in stride. By this, I mean a revolution was attempted in Russia, and riots occurred in both countries. Nice foreshadowing.
But why Portsmouth?
Thankfully, the reasons for this are easily searchable and clear. The reasons for this exist somewhere. Reading it like it's Brinkley. None of the books I have on hand seem to mention Portsmouth beyond the treaty itself, and most websites don't have a real reason at all. On Wikipedia, the reason for Portsmouth is that it was cooler, with a better climate than Washington, D.C. in August. They cite a book by Rotem Callner. This book cost $100, but thankfully I happened upon a completely legal copy somehow, which, sure enough, says the exact same thing.
On as lovely a day as this, you can really tell why they chose Portsmouth.
This isn't enough for me, though. I found another source, which states in its introduction that the people of Portsmouth helped the negotiations proceed smoothly. It's written by the Japan Society of New Hampshire. However, they do give a reason for the meeting, helpfully enclosed within a section labeled Why Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where they state, in the belief that a New Hampshire location would boost the tourist economy, the owners of the Mount Washington Hotel at Bretton Woods told Governor John McLean they would host a peace conference and assume all costs. This is a fairly sound reason. Everyone loves money, after all, but I would love to look at their sources. Just gotta navigate the page, click on sources, and I wonder who this coming fellow is. Apparently, the Russians wanted The Hague, but Japan wanted Washington. This is corroborated by the Portsmouth website. The Russians conceded, and Washington was the place of meeting until the switch to Portsmouth was made. I guess the Portsmouth Peace Treaty website might be right. Well, it's pretty late, so I probably shouldn't try to investigate this history any further. But the John Paul Jones House in Portsmouth does have an exhibit on this treaty.
Sadly, the John Paul Jones House was closed. Fortunately, I brought a way in.
Well, we made it here, and it appears that I should trust the sources, because they say the exact same thing. But what were the effects? Well, for one, Japan was now definitely world power, scoring a victory over a Western empire, a feat China had failed. It also may have helped destabilize Russia just a bit more, which would boil over about a decade later. Either way, if you want to get a better view of the history on this subject, the John Paul Jones House is open for the summer, and you can even still see the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, which, true to its name, is located in Maine.